today I wanted to talk about how to take care of your horse in extreme weather. If you find this video helpful, make sure you give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for some more weekly horse videos. Okay, so how to care for your horse in bad weather. For those of you who don't know, I live in Oklahoma. I've lived here for 4 years. You can see that this room is pretty empty because we're moving to Virginia. Oklahoma is definitely known for its tornado season. And so I've learned some things here, not only about tornadoes, but about flooding and just about some other weather things. And when it comes to owning horses, what you need to be aware of. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is how to take care of your horse in the rain. So this may be something as horse owners that you can just easily overlook because horses are out in the rain all the time, especially if they live out 24/7 in the pasture. But sometimes you just get those seasons where it just rains way too much. This last year has actually been one of the wettest Oklahoma years on record. Usually Oklahoma's really dry and they have droughts. But this year wasn't like that. It rained a lot. So, especially since my horse was used to living in kind of like the arid terrain that Oklahoma is, I had to make sure I monitored him just to see how he was going to handle the rain and also how his body was going to handle it. The first thing you want to do if you're dealing with a lot of rain is make sure your horse has adequate shelter. This is for obvious reasons, so if your horse wants to get out of the rain, they can go in the shelter, or if they're stable, that's great. You'll just keep them out of the wet. If your horse gets too wet, it can cause them to get some fungal infections, or it can maybe cause them to get cold and get chilled. So that's another thing I wanted to talk about. If it's raining, it's always important to cater to your horse's specific needs. So all the horses I've ever had have always lived out 24/7, no matter what the weather really. Tucker and one of my other horses, they did great. They can handle anything. They can handle the cold, handle the rain. But I have this thoroughbred named Pepper, who, if it would be 60 degrees and rainy, she would start to shiver. So she's one that would need a turnout blanket on, or she would need to go in the stable, because for whatever reason, she just can't handle the cold. So if you're working with a horse like that, just make sure you cater to their needs. My thing is, I don't want Pepper to be outside freezing and miserable, so I'll just put a turnout sheet on her or bring her in for the day. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, when it's raining, you want to watch out for fungal infections on your horse. So this can look like rain rot. In the colder and winter months when your horse has started to grow out their winter coat and it rains, their long coat actually contains the moisture to their skin, and that's what causes rain rot. So if your horse is out in the rain and it's those months where their coats are getting longer, you're going to want to make sure you're checking them for that. Another fungal infection you need to be aware of, especially in wet environments, is thrush. And I sure do hate thrush, and I think every horse owner does as well. Thrush is a fungal infection that happens to your horse's hooves, and the fungus will eat away at their hooves and cause them to stink, and it will cause this black goo inside of them. You just want to make sure you treat that. There's a number of ways to treat it. I actually have a video about a certain product called Pure Soul that I use to treat thrush, and that product is awesome. So maybe I'll add the description down below. But horses' feet are actually very sensitive in wet environments. So when it's wet outside, your horse's hoof naturally becomes more soft because it's been absorbing all that water. And so it's a lot easier for them to absorb things into their hooves that they shouldn't be absorbing, like that thrush fungus or some other kind of parasite or bacteria that can cause an abscess, or just things like that. And their hooves will actually grow out a lot faster in wet environments. So that's just something to be aware of. If you live in a wet environment, just be sure to check your horse's feet on a regular basis and make sure that they're not having any issues. Okay, the second severe weather I wanted to talk about when it comes to caring for your horse is how to care for your horse in snow. When I say snow, I mean a lot of snow. One childhood memory that rings to mind when I mention snow and horses is that I boarded at a stable where the barn manager didn't live on property. There was someone who did live on the property, but they didn't run the barn or anything. So it was calling for some crazy snow in the forecast. And so the barn manager ended up sleeping in the barn to ensure that she could, tend to the horses the next morning. And sure enough, it snowed 3 feet. And then she was there, so she didn't have to worry about driving there in the snow. and then she could take care of the horses. So it's important if snow is in the forecast to make sure that someone has access to the barn and the horses in that situation. So if that means like someone needs to stay at the barn for the night or stay at a house on the property or anything like that, you just want to arrange ahead of time for someone to be there to take care of the horses. Depending on the amount of snow you're getting, horses can get snowed in. So if they're in the stable, you may have to shovel them out and shovel them a path out of their stall so they can get to the pasture and just stuff like that. So that's why it's important just to be prepared for snow and crazy weather like that. Another thing to keep in mind is a lot of people like to stable their horses if there's a lot of snow in the forecast. I completely understand this. I'd probably do the same thing. One thing that's important is you need to make sure that wherever you're stabling your horse, that barn has the ability to support the amount of snow that's coming. Because the worst thing that could happen is you're stabling your horse, it snows and the roof collapses. So you just want to make sure you know those things ahead of time before you arrange for your horse's shelter. If you're dealing with snow and horses, another thing to be aware of is that horses will get snowballs in their feet, especially if they have shoes on. It gets really bad. And what this is, the snow will pack into the horse's hooves, and so they can legit be walking on like a foot of snow under the hoof like this. And it looks horrible and it looks painful. So if you live in an area that you know it's gonna snow, one thing I did that definitely kept those snowballs away in the horse's hooves is before the winter season hit, I put pads in my horse's horseshoes, and that pretty much keeps those snowballs out of their hooves. Okay, so if a snowstorm is coming or it has snowed, you just want to make sure that your horse still has access to food and water. If there's a lot of snow, you may need to shovel a path for the horses to get to their water, and also making sure that the water hasn't frozen over, that they can still drink it. And then you're also just going to want to make sure that your horse has access to food, especially if they were before relying on grass that's now covered in snow. So actually, you know, when it snows, usually it's cold. And so if you're wondering if your horse is going to be warm enough, if a horse has constant access to food, the majority of them will be fine, because eating is what keeps them warm and it helps them produce heat in their body. So just making sure they have enough food so that they can stay warm and that they can just also get the nutrition they need. Alright, now for the interesting and probably terrifying one. How to take care of a horse in a tornado. This last year that I've lived here in Oklahoma, I think it broke the records for the amount of tornadoes we had in the summer season. It was crazy. Like, tornado sirens were going off every night. I went to the park and the park had been like destroyed and these huge trees had been ripped out of the ground. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. You're probably wondering, well, what the heck do you do with your horses in a tornado? There's not really a good answer. What I've heard from like the news stations and stuff like that is it's probably best to actually leave your horse out in the pasture rather than put them in the stable. Just because in the pasture they can flee, you know, they just have more room to go if they need to, rather than in a stable and the tornado's heading for the stable, the tornado can just obliterate the barn. So it's best to keep them out in the pasture. This is just a hard one because at one point I want to put them in a field that has shelter and trees because I want them to be protected from the wind and the hail and the tornadoes. But at the same time, if you put them out in a field that has trees, those trees can become flying debris. So it's just a difficult situation altogether. I think prepare ahead of time, like think about your plan ahead of time. It's crazy, but I've actually seen people who have tornado shelters for their horses. It's like this aisle that goes through their barn and then it slopes down into the ground and the horses can be led down into this bunker. And if you have one of those, that's awesome. I would just make sure beforehand that your horse is comfortable walking down there and being down there, because I would hate for it to be a tornado watch and you're trying to lead your horse down there and they're refusing to go. I've also heard that if there's a tornado watch, either put a breakaway halter on your horse that has your phone number on it, or write in a grease pen on your horse your phone number. Just in case the horse gets carried or you get separated, you can be contacted if someone finds your horse. Caring for your horse in flooding. So another thing about Oklahoma, we have crazy floods. And we had crazy floods this last year with the tornadoes, and it was a record-breaking season. But it also made me very aware of having a plan if I needed to evacuate my horse. So that is my first point when it comes to dealing with horses and floods, is have an evacuation plan. Have an idea where you want to evacuate your horse to. If you don't have a trailer or a truck, have a plan on how you plan on getting them there. And that will just save you a lot of stress when, if God forbid that situation happens, you'll have this plan in place that you know you can follow, rather than having to just figure it out on the way, which can be terrifying. So if you're caught in short notice around flooding, the best thing you can do is probably move your horse up to the highest property possible. You know, whether it's like higher land, just don't keep them in the lowlands. And I don't know if y'all have heard of the Misty of Chincoteague story, but Misty's a pretty famous horse from the coast of Virginia, where I'm from. And they had a hurricane and it was crazy flooding, so they actually put the horses in the house because the house was on the high ground and they didn't think that it would flood. So they put their horses in the house, they filled the sink up with water and left hay, and then the people had to evacuate. But the horse was fine in the end, and she even gave birth to a foal in the house. I guess the point of Misty of Chincoteague is just move your horse up to the highest land possible. If you're dedicated enough to put them in your house, then put them in your house. I know I would. Another thing is have extra food on hand just in case your horse gets trapped. I mean, even if it's kind of flooding around you, you still want to make sure your horse has access to adequate water and grazing or hay or just any kind of forage that they can eat. Just like tornadoes, you're probably going to want to put identification on your horse. Whether, like I said, a breakaway halter with your phone number, or whether you're riding in a grease pen. That way, God forbid something happens and your horse gets carried off or something horrible like that, and someone finds them, or if you had to evacuate, that way someone can contact you. Caring for your horse in a hailstorm. The big thing when it comes to dealing with your horse in a hailstorm is just making sure that they have secure shelter. And whether you're stabling them or if they're out in the pasture and they have a run-in shed. If it was me and I knew a hailstorm was coming, I'd probably just be cautious and bring all my horses into the barn just to make sure no one's injured. Okay, the last extreme situation I want to talk about when it comes to caring for your horse is if you're caring for your horse and there's a fire, whether it's a forest fire, a wildfire, a bushfire. This is a scary situation and it's dangerous, and it may seem like one that's pretty helpless, like if there's a tornado. These are hard situations because in reality, when it comes down to it, you don't know what the situation is going to be. If you've actually gone through this and you have better points, just comment down below. This video is about helping people, and I want to make sure that this is going to help people who have horses to just create the best situation for the horse, even if that's hard to do. So that's why we're talking about this in this video. So caring for a horse in fire. The biggest thing is having an evacuation plan, even if it's not fire season or whatever. Just making sure you have a plan. If there's a fire coming, what are you going to do? If your horse has to be evacuated, where are they going to go? If there is a fire, at what point do you choose to evacuate? Like, how close are you going to evacuate? Just because I've heard stories of, like, you know, there's a fire and then people realize that the fire's just too close and they don't have time to get the horses and get out, which, you know, that's a sad situation and it's scary, but it's real. Like, this happens. Fires can just start, and I mean, there's no blame on the people who have been in these situations because it's a life or death situation and you have to make the right choice. But that's why it's important to have an evacuation plan for your horse ahead of time. I'm sure if you live in an area where fires are definitely a threat, you can just start asking around in the community, and I'm sure people will have recommendations for this. I was just reading about the California fires back in like 2003, and a lot of horses got evacuated to some of the racetracks out there. And so, you know, just researching things like that and knowing where to send your horse. Also, if you don't have a way of transporting them, like if you don't have a truck or a trailer, how do you plan on transporting them over there? And just things like that. So like I mentioned, I know these situations are scary and sometimes they're just random, and God forbid any of us have to go through them, but some of us have had to. So for the sake of helping other horseback riders out there and other horse owners, if you have a tip for handling these situations with your horses, comment below. Like, I want to know them for the future, and I'm sure a lot of other people want to know them as well. So if this video was helpful to you, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for weekly horse videos.